2026 Leon Panetta Lecture Series. The 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. What will be its legacy in the 21st century? This lecture discusses the lessons of history. Do Americans still believe in the Constitution and the values of our democracy? Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sylvia Panetta.
What a wonderful turnout, and welcome. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to welcome you to the opening of the new season of the Leon Panetta Lecture Series, coming to you from Leon's hometown of Monterey and the beautiful Monterey Conference Center. You know, nearly 30 years ago, we began this series with a simple hope that our community would embrace a forum where people could gather to explore the challenges facing our country through civil, balanced, and meaningful conversation. Today, when public discourse is so partisan and divided, that mission feels especially urgent. Leon and I are so thankful for the steadfast support of this community, which allows these evenings to reach far beyond this lecture hall. To our friends watching on television and to the students who joined us earlier today, you are what sustains this series, and we're delighted to begin another year together. This year, our nation celebrates the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the start of the great experiment of the American democracy. Across the nation, preparations are underway, a celebration of the courage, of the foresight, and of the democratic conviction of our founders. Yet, this anniversary arrives at a moment when many Americans are uneasy about the durability of the very principles the founders advanced. In consideration of this complicated milestone, this year's lecture series looks ahead and asks, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, what will be its legacy in the 21st century? Our discussion tonight begins with a focus on the lessons of history. Do Americans still believe in the Constitution and the values of our democracy? America's confidence in our democratic institution is being tested. There are concerns about the erosion of checks and balances, the lack of congressional oversight, and attacks on the free press and the diminishing of the basic civic norms that have protected our democracy throughout history. From the Civil War to McCarthyism to Watergate to January 6th, our democracy has been tested before, and each time it has proven its resilience. Can it do so again? Leon will discuss this theme with two celebrated presidential historians and two award-winning journalists. Now, our first guest is the Catherine Sanoff Brown Chair in Humanities and Professor of History at Rice University, a CNN presidential historian and contributing editor at Vanity Fair. He received 8 honorary doctorates in American Studies and works in many capacities in the world of public history, including on boards, museums, colleges, and historical societies. He has published best-selling books on the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt, Jimmy Carter, and Ronald Reagan, and he's covered subjects including American foreign policy, the Louisiana Purchase, D-Day, the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, and Hurricane Katrina. The Chicago Tribune dubbed him America's new past master, and the New York Historical Society named him as their official United States presidential historian. 6 of his books were named the New York Times Notable Books of the Year, and 7 became the New York Times bestsellers. So please welcome Dr. Douglas Brinkley.
Thank you.
Our second guest is an historian of the presidency, political culture, and the government. She is the executive director of the George Washington Presidential Library. Before assuming her current post, she was a senior non-residential fellow at the Center for Presidential History at Southern Methodist University and an historian at the White House Historical Association. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Cabinet, George Washington and the Creation of an American Institution. It was published in April 2020, and she's also the co-editor of Mourning the Presidents, Loss and Legacy in American Culture, published in 2023. Her third book, Making the Presidency, John Adams and the Precedents that Forged the Republic, was published in 2024. Please welcome Dr. Lindsay Chervinsky. Our next guest has been a columnist for the New York Times since 2001. A 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner, his op-ed columns appear twice a week. After joining the New York Times in 1984, initially covering economics, he served as a Times correspondent in Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Beijing, and Tokyo. He also covered presidential politics and is the author of the chapter on President George W. Bush in the reference books, The Presidents. In 1990, he and his wife, Cheryl Wudun, then also a Times journalist, won a Pulitzer Prize for their coverage of China's Tiananmen Square democracy movement. They were the first married couple to win a Pulitzer for journalism and went on to write 5 best-selling books together. In addition to many other awards and honors, in 2006, he won a second Pulitzer for commentary on the genocide in Darfur. His most recent book is the memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life. Please welcome Nicholas Kristof. Our final guest is an author, Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker, and expert on White House operations. He has been called an indispensable observer of American power. A former producer for CBS News 60 Minutes, he is the author of several books on the presidency and the White House. His books, The Gatekeepers, How the White House Chiefs of Staff Define Every Presidency, and The Spy Masters, How the CIA Directors Shape History in the Future, were both New York Times bestsellers. Peter Baker, chief White House correspondent of the New York Times, calls him a premier journalist and historian of the White House as well as the intelligence community. His December 2025 Vanity Fair article offered a previously unprecedented accounting of the first year of the second Trump White House. In addition to Vanity Fair, he has contributed to Politico, also to the Daily Beast and many other publications. Please welcome Chris Whipple. And moderating our discussion is the man who created this lecture series, the former United States representative for this district, and the former director of the CIA and Secretary of Defense. He's also a former White House Chief of Staff, Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and Director of the Office for Civil Rights. As someone devoted to history, he has dedicated his more than 50 career years in public service to our democracy and to preserving it for future generations. So please welcome Secretary Leon Panetta. You're welcome.
Thank you, and good evening to all of you, and welcome to this, our 2026 Panetta Lecture Series. This is our 29th year of bringing these discussions on our democracy to all of you. What better way to celebrate than to focus on our theme, the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and what will be its legacy in the 21st century. Tonight we look at the lessons of history. Do we still believe in our Constitution and the values of our democracy? Our values are spelled out in the Declaration of Independence in a very historical sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are all created equal. Our rights and freedoms are spelled out in the Constitution. Freedom of speech, of assembly, of religion, of the press, fidelity to due process, the rule of law, the right to vote, to bear arms, to be free from unreasonable searches, and yes to the truth. These are our values, our rights, and our freedoms. And they define who we are as a people. Today, there's no question that they're being tested by events here at home and events in the world. And they're also tested by deep political and partisan divisions in our own country that are trying to drive us apart. But whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, or whether you're from a red state or a blue state, I firmly believe that all Americans embrace our values. The issue we explore tonight is not what these values are, but whether we still have the courage to support and maintain these values in the 21st century. So let me begin, speaking of events in the world. I've got to begin with a question about the history that's being made as we sit here tonight. The war in Iran. You are historians, you're journalists. Nick, you've actually been to Iran and know the territory. The United States and Israel attacked Iran Saturday morning. And there's now an indication that there will be perhaps 4 to 5 weeks of continuing air attacks that will go on. American lives have been lost. The supreme leader has been killed. The president talked about regime change as the objective. And very frankly, the United States does not have a very good record on regime change or nation building. Witness what happened in Iraq, in Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya, and others. So The issue is, can you bomb your way to regime change? Or does it have to come from the people of Iran? And I think the history tells us it doesn't happen from the top down, it happens from the bottom up. So the issue before us that I want you to discuss is, and look, we could spend the whole night on this issue, but if you could briefly comment on it, I would appreciate it. What are your thoughts on what has happened? Can this end in a new democratic Iran, end well? Or can the present regime remain in power and then remain a threat to the United States and the world? Is this a war that will succeed, or is this another failed war in the Middle East? Nick, let's start with you.
Easy questions go to the journalist here. So first, let me just say, to Leon and Sylvia, thank you so much for bringing us here, for convening this discussion, and for all you do to inspire young people toward a life of service. So hugely appreciated. And I'm your neighbor from the state of Oregon to the north, and we actually grow Pinot Noir grapes on our farm. So it's a special pleasure for me to come to a state that is well known for producing some of the world's second best Pinot Noir. I guess in a conversation about civility, I shouldn't start by insulting the place I'm visiting, but I couldn't resist. My apologies. So Iran. And I should. I would be in Iran right now if the Iranians had only approved my visa request of about 2 weeks ago. But my wife is so happy that they rejected it, so maybe it all worked out. Could things work out brilliantly and democracy take hold? I mean, they could. It's not impossible. I do think, and I can't think of a country I've traveled in where there is so widespread antagonism toward the government. It is probably, at the people-to-people level, the most pro-American country in the Middle East. I once, the former U.S. embassy that was taken over in the Iranian Revolution is now called the Den of Spies, and it's a IRGC base. And I once dropped by there, and I was chatting with this IRGC guard in front, and he happened to mention that his favorite movie was Titanic, and we talked more, and he complained about corruption in Iran, and then he started asking me about how he could get to the U.S. and live his dream. And this is the IRGC. So is it possible that everything will work out? It's possible, but I think that would be an absolute best case, unlikely scenario. And I think it's a huge mistake to declare wars on the basis of best case assumptions. In general, as you say, air wars have a very poor record of bringing about regime change. And I think the best example recently is that the Biden and Trump administration spent $7 billion bombing Yemen, which has an even weaker, more fragile, more unpopular government than Iran, and we couldn't even dislodge the Houthi leaders there. And so the idea that we are somehow going to, even in 5 weeks, overturn the government of Iran seems to me very unlikely. And in the meantime, there are real costs. There are, as of a little bit ago when I checked my phone, we're up to 6 U.S. service people who have died. That number will increase. We've obviously lost the girls who were at this girls' school that was apparently inadvertently bombed. Oil prices are up. And it is quite possible that if the regime is overturned, it'll actually be the IRGC that will take over rather than Democrats. So I see enormous risks ahead, limited likelihood of success, and meanwhile, maybe the most basic question for a president is, does his policy make us safer? And there was no imminent threat. The Iranian nuclear program was buried under rubble. Its proxies were on their heels. There was some prospect of change after the supreme leader, who was 86 already, after him. And it is possible that instead of accelerating that change, we also actually calcify the process. So it seems to me this is another vainglorious effort to reshape the world and tackle a genuine problem with a military toolbox that is ill-suited for the aspirations that we're applying to it.
Lindsay, the historian's viewpoint of what's going on.
Well, historians are really terrible at predicting the future, as a general rule of thumb. Our job is to look the other direction and to try and understand how we got to our current moment. But I'd like to tie it actually to the revolutionary moment, because that is, of course, the 250th anniversary of what we're celebrating this year. And one of the things that I always draw actually tremendous comfort from studying the revolution is that it was an 8-year-long conflict. And in those 8 years, they did not know how it was going to end. They did not know what the outcome was going to be, and their predictions for what they thought the outcome might be shifted pretty dramatically depending on any given year. And in those 8 years, I think the two constants that they held on to and that we can look to was that both they understood that even if they didn't know what was happening next, they were living through a historic moment. That much was very, very clear to them, that whatever the outcome, they were experiencing something that was changing the world. And the second piece was that despite the war, despite the conflict, despite the deprivation and the violence, they also had to live, and their lives continued. One of my favorite examples is Abigail Adams. While she was in the middle of trying to figure out how to take care of her children while her husband away, also loved to play matchmaker and would set up marriages and then host the wedding celebrations, because she just loved weddings and loved marriages. And this was during the war. And so I think that I draw those parallels to our current moment, which is that we know we're seeing history. We know that it is being made on so many fronts. And frankly, speaking for all of us, I think we'd rather write about interesting times than live through them. Maybe not journalists. Maybe maybe your bread and butter is interesting times, but I'm really okay living through a boring one. So we know we're seeing history. We just don't know what is coming next. And that is a very human experience.
Doug?
And to build on that, I think, who writes the history, how does one interpret it? I was Rosa Parks's biographer, and when I spent time in Montgomery, Alabama, there were 8 people on December 1, 1955 that were on the bus. I met 47 of them. Everybody in Montgomery was on Rosa Parks's bus. And reflecting on what you were saying, thinking about John Adams and Jefferson, and just how vicious that 1800 presidential election was, creating political parties. They're not in the Constitution. It's not in the Declaration of Independence. They're going to be ripping at each other every 4 years in the way that we have. But in their wisdom and older age, Adams and Jefferson, who really didn't like each other and couldn't agree on a fundamental thing of history. Jefferson believed the Revolutionary War, starts with Patrick Henry in Virginia, and Adams says it's the Boston Massacre. Meaning we argue about where all of these sort of things, but they had in their older age in retirement started corresponding with each other. And it's really valuable to read the Jefferson-Adams correspondence and see two of our founders had so many disagreements, sending a message to heal, that we can pull together and be as one. I think from pulling back on this moment in history, people are going to look at Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu and U.S.-Israeli relations in this period. Where it's an entity unto its own. Harry Truman, all the credit in history, they stood up and helped create the state of Israel. But there was dissension in the Truman administration by George Marshall and James Forrestal and others about Israel. And then since then, you can look at how different presidents' relationship with Israel evolves or devolves and all of the rest. And you're seeing in two terms of Trump a very deep alliance that he has with Netanyahu, U.S., Israel, including shocking people moving the capital from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and so when we do specialty books like who was Bill Clinton's close, was it Tony Blair, or which you're going to be looking at this Trump-Netanyahu alliance, and how is this? What's going on in world history? Is it just a reaction of October 7th and the horror that occurred? Is it about Israel, Gaza, or is this a geopolitical realignment going on here that Israel is going to be a superpower in that region, and Iran has been a nuisance to the United States from a long time. Jimmy Carter, as you remember, invariably with the hostage crisis, refused to, nobody's going to die. The only time I saw his born-again Christianity kind of really come policy, I mean, even talked when they try to do a rescue of the hostages about using rubber bullets. I don't want somebody to get killed over there. And Carter really didn't win politically on holding out and not bombing Tehran, going in there and bombing Iran. He just waited and negotiated. And at last they got freed only when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. But in Middle East history, Jimmy Carter has a role. I mean, he made peace between Egypt and Israel, and everybody celebrates Camp David, but he's not liked by a lot of people, Carter, for that either. And right now, it's I think with Iran, we've got to look. It's a horrendous regime, human rights abuses galore. Thousands of people recently just killed. Nobody here, I believe, is on once the clerics of Iran to succeed, but it seems impetuous and misguided to me of President Trump to not bring a country along and not care about War Powers Act, which has become part of America after Vietnam and all that our country went through, and not wanting to keep Congress in the dark. So what history may be looking at, due to the Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, not the terrorists, but that the president has so much power, and now his power to go on his phone and say, we're going to bomb this, do that, do this. It creates a kind of breakdown of our constitutional order that I find very serious. But he did it, Trump, where we want to pull for our men and women in the armed forces. We want the United States to prevail, but it's a hell of a way to run a foreign policy on whim and fancy, and the consequences can be, World War I started for assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. Just because there were some successes of Trump, or at least perceived ones, when he did a limited strike in the Middle East, or Venezuela. It all might be maybe good and well, but things can unspool quickly, and now our country is mired in something that has the potential to just go out of control in so many different directions. We didn't mention with the dead. I'm from Austin, Texas. 3 people were killed last night over this, murdered. The tensions now are boiling over the pot, and I'm not reassured unless President Trump can have some Chuck Schumer or Warner or some of the Democrats explain to us what is going to happen here, because we're now just dealing with an authoritarian president doing what he wants willy-nilly. Whether it's a right decision or wrong decision, history will, I suppose, judge, but it doesn't play into the idea of Congress being an equal branch of government of the president.
Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I want to amplify what Doug was saying, but first just to say what an honor it is to be here with such smart friends and with you, Leon. I was telling the students earlier today that nobody was better than Leon Panetta as White House Chief of Staff at walking in, for many reasons, but among them being able to walk into the Oval Office, close the door, and tell Bill Clinton what he didn't want to hear. That, sadly, is not happening on a daily basis or at all in the Trump White House. And I know something about that, having you know, I mean, Doug gets to be the biographer of Rosa Parks. I'm the biographer of Susie Wiles. Thanks a lot, Doug. But I can tell you, having spent a lot of time talking to people in the Trump White House, what troubles me is, look, it's important how wars end. We're going to find out soon enough with this conflict. It's also important how wars start. How presidents get us into these wars to begin with. I mean, we haven't had a congressional declaration of war since 1941, post Pearl Harbor. It's true. Bill Daley, who was Barack Obama's second White House chief, told me that it's way too easy for presidents to get us into wars. I mean, they can do it almost at will. That is exponentially more true today than ever. None of us knows how this war will end, at least of all Donald Trump, I would argue, because he is somebody who is incapable of being briefed. I wrote a piece in the Washington Post during his first term called The Unbriefable President. CIA briefers would come in and try to brief him, and he would simply talk over them. There's been no process to speak of in this walk up to this deadly war. Usually in a White House, you have some consultation with Congress. A president tries to make a case to the American people, and there's a thorough process in the National Security Council weighing risks, and every principal is there to weigh these decisions before they're made. That's essentially gone. This National Security Council has been virtually gutted, and foreign policy is being made, and war is being declared by whim. And that's a very troubling place that we are in the current day.
Let me ask you, Nick, a quick question. I was a little surprised that, you know, by the fact that there were Arab countries that were saying to the United States, don't do this. And I think we're trying to say, you know, don't get into war right now. We don't need it. But Iran, in its response, suddenly goes after, I think, almost 8 Arab countries. Now, I know we have bases there, but they're hitting the UAE, they're hitting their capital, they're hitting hotels. You know, it's pretty devastating. Did they make a mistake, or did they have some reason to start bombing Arab countries and not just Israel and United States bases?
So there is an underlying tension, and my understanding is that MBS in Saudi Arabia was actually telling Trump, go ahead and hit Iran, that the others were not, but that Saudi Arabia was. But I mean, it is odd that Iran is striking the neighboring Arab countries more than it's striking Israel, for example. And I think the reason is that Iran is trying to push Trump to back off. I think the Iranians think that Trump does not have staying power, that the U.S. does not have strategic patience, that it does. And I think that it thinks that the neighboring Arab countries like the UAE, like Qatar, like Kuwait, are very vulnerable, which is, you know, absolutely true. And that if it puts pressure on them and closes the Dubai airport, for example, closes or limits oil shipments out of the Strait of Hormuz, then those countries will in turn put pressure on President Trump to find an escape route, take an off-ramp. And that's possible. I mean, there's also the risk for Iran that instead the Arab countries will get so indignant that they will themselves strike Iran or allow their bases to be used to strike Iran. So it's, I think, a calculation that Iran has made. I don't know if it's correct.
Yeah. Okay, well, obviously we all hope for the best here, because there are young men and women who are being put into harm's way. And we in the very least need a clear objective. It would be nice to have a clear strategy, and it would be nice to have an end game as to where we're heading.
We have great tactics, but a confused strategy.
Yeah. Let me turn to some of the subjects we wanted to cover. Checks and balances in our democracy. I mean, look, we've had presidents who've sought additional power. Jackson, Lincoln, the Roosevelts, Truman to some extent, others, and now Trump. One of the checks and balances is the Congress. And it strikes me that the Congress is so dysfunctional right now, so divided, that it's unable to govern. And to some extent, by virtue of its dysfunction, it's almost inviting presidential power because they can't even govern together. They can't act. Why is Congress failing to be a check?
So I think there are a couple of key factors. I mean, there have been ebbs and flows over the course of American history where you see strong presidents and then periods of time where it's almost hard to remember who was president. If you play that game where you try and list them all, there's a reason people stumble when they get to the 1840s and 50s, and they stumble when they get to the 1880s and 90s. It's hard to remember who was there because Congress was at its sort of peak power in those moments. And so that ebb and flow is quite natural. What I think is unusual about this moment, and I wouldn't say it's just right now, I think this has been a process that started a couple of decades ago, but it has accelerated in the last couple of years, is that Congress is willingly relinquishing its power as an institution. And this was something that the framers, while I did expect that there would be partisan politics, and I know we're going to talk more about that later, they thought that in the course of human history, humans tend to be jealous of their own power. They don't want to give it up reluctantly. And institutions tend to be jealous of their own power and are not willing to give it up reluctantly. And so the fact that Congress has not only failed to practice oversight over the presidency, but it's also failed to practice oversight over the Supreme Court. Until the end of the 20th century, Congress regularly decided what was Supreme Court jurisdiction because that is their right under the Constitution. And they have stopped doing that. So as an institution, they have laid down and just abdicated their authority before these other two branches, inviting the increase in power in a way that I don't think we've seen in American history. And that is partly because we don't have strong parties that are facilitating sort of cross-party cooperation and community building. So there isn't a sense of being a congressman as an identity. But I also think it is this increasing what we would call the C-SPANification of Congress. And this really started with Newt Gingrich, where when you're in Congress and you're giving speech, you can give a speech to an empty chamber. It doesn't matter if it's being streamed on television. And so I think that a lot of the incentives have shifted away from having a strong identity as an institution and towards how much money can you raise with a TV hit.
Doug?
There are no profiles in courage, or very few going on right now. If you go look at, say, Franklin Roosevelt, who won the big election in 1932, Great Depression, brought in the New Deal, all of those programs. Then he won again in 1936. And he didn't like that he was being stymied by the Supreme Court on some of his New Deal measures, executive orders getting booted back and this like. So what did FDR do in early 1937? He tried to pack the Supreme Court. He tried to go from 9 justices to 15. Now, this is not a bunch of dorm room, banter, like, maybe we can do it. He went for it, Roosevelt. It's incredible hubris. And who stopped him? Democrats in his own party. Southern Democrats said, no, bridge too far. To their own guy who just won the big landslide, EFDR, no, we're not doing it. Look at Richard Nixon in the woes of the Watergate years. After, we can talk about many things with it, but a key thing is when Republicans told Nixon, we're done with you. When Barry Goldwater said, you lied to me, you're not fit to be president, go. When Howard Baker, Republicans, said, go. We're not seeing a Republican Party stand up to Trump, with the exception of Rand Paul and Massey, the Kentuckians. There are very, very few that are willing to put skin in the game and tell Trump, no, no, no. So they've rubber stamped him. And without strong voices in the Republican Party, a gang of 8 in the Senate or something that will be able to curtail some of Trump's behavior, he, left to his own devices, will break every law known to humanity, because that's how he's wired. And famously, when Richard Nixon went on the David Frost show on BBC and made the famous Nixon line about Watergate, Nixon said, everybody else went to jail around Nixon, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Colson, Mitchell, but not, he got pardoned by an executive order by Jerry Ford. And Nixon now said, my view is if the president does it, it must be legal. And that's President Trump's view. Everything his sense, because he doesn't read history or understand constitutional law, that he's a gut player from watching television and reading people over the decades, that is, he could do what he wants. And the Supreme Court under Roberts kind of gave him a boost. Yeah, you can. And this has been a project of a strong presidency. The Federalist Society has been pushing this. We were talking about the Heritage Foundation's 2025 report. Even the Heritage Foundation, it's a white paper. They can't believe these things are being actualized by Trump. Yeah. And so that part's frightening, because the only guardrails we really had have been the court system, which has hung up was done really great work in kind of weeding things out, but President Trump swamps that system. And law can go slow. You're not going to get an instant, so it might be a process. And instead, we're getting hit by nanosecond, nanosecond, nanosecond. And the last thing, that first executive order of the second term of Donald Trump was an executive order in front of a sports arena full of people with the big Donald J. Trump, which was to free all of the insurrectionists of January 6th. And we still haven't historically reckoned with January 6th. You have no idea how hard it was to try to even get a plaque put in the Capitol to say January 6th happened. So we are living in history in very kind of hurly-burly times right now, and don't feel you're alone if you're trying to make sense of where things are going. It's just the pace has become so rapid in the age of AI.
Let me ask about the Supreme Court as a check, and the court says it's check. There are now almost 239 cases, actually 300 when you look at some of the additional appeals, et cetera, that involve challenging the actions of the administration. And judges are often ruling against the administration. The Supreme Court obviously is more conservative, has ruled for Trump in emergency cases and in providing immunity from prosecution for breaking the law in the course of official duties. But recently, the court, in a very high-profile case, ruled 6-3 that the president's broad use of tariffs violated the Constitution because Congress had not provided that authority. How significant is that case in terms of the court drawing a line as far as executive authority is concerned?
I think it's extremely significant. I was telling the students before that I'm old enough to remember the bicentennial in 1976 when the tall ships were sailing in New York Harbor, and we'd managed somehow to get through the Vietnam War and through Watergate. The system had prevailed, but there was a book at the time Arthur Schlesinger wrote called The Imperial Presidency, which almost seems like child's play compared to what we've seen with Donald Trump. This is someone who respects no constraints. Nixon knew there were certain lines he would not cross. He had, as flawed as he was, as corrupt as he was, there was a certain baseline respect for constitutional standards. Not so with Trump. He doesn't understand the Constitution. He believes that he can do anything he wants. And the Supreme Court, the bad news is the Supreme Court has given him reason with the immunity ruling to think that he can get away with anything. But I will tell you this for whatever it's worth on a slightly hopeful note, and that is that during the time that I spent with Susie Wiles, I spent 11 months talking to her, and at one point early on I said, this was at a time when the Trump White House was flouting various court rulings on immigration and other areas. I said, will the president ultimately respect a decision by the Supreme Court? And her answer was absolutely. But then she went on to add, but we think we're going to win a lot more cases than anybody thinks. So maybe there's that hopeful note. On the other hand, she also told me that she had a deal with the president that he would end the revenge and retribution campaign after 90 days. So take that with a with a caveat.
Okay, what about the court decision? Nick, what do you think?
So I think there are a couple of encouraging signs. A year ago, there was this fundamental doubt about whether the Trump administration would follow the courts, as Chris suggests. And it did seem as if the Supreme Court, in case after case, mostly involving process rather than substance, was completely rolling over and was supine toward the president. And now you get a clearer sense that it is likely that at the end of the day, Trump is going to adhere to court rulings, and it seems a little bit more likely after that 6-3 decision, and also after so many other circuit and district judges have spoken up, that the president at the end of the day will be subject to at least some degree of a check from the courts. And I think it's partly also that the degree of contempt coming from the Department of Justice toward the federal judiciary has become increasingly obvious and leading to judges like Jim Boasberg, incredibly respected, just expressing their exasperation in a way that I do think gets the attention of people like John Roberts.
Lindsay, what do you think?
I agree with a lot that's been said. I think for me, the biggest takeaway from this moment was twofold. It was one, that there are certain powers that the court is not willing to negotiate, that they belong to Congress. There are things that belong to Congress no matter what. And that, I think, people had questions about. And so the fact that that is still a principle that holds is valuable. I also think to a certain extent there were questions about, were there any institutional checks left? And we have seen, even sort of in the wake of this court decision, a number of businesses sort of push back in certain ways. There was the Anthropic decision to push back against the Department of Defense, and of course Netflix refused to kind of bow down and stepped out of the deal that they were negotiating. And so I think that, Doug was talking about how there aren't a whole lot of profiles in courage. Well, courage begets courage, and resistance begets resistance, and institutional strength encourages others to demonstrate institutional strength. And so even if the Supreme Court isn't going to restrain the president in a lot of different ways, occasionally throwing the elbow is really important to encourage other people to do so as well.
Yeah, great. Doug?
Good, great point. Yeah, I find that to be a really important point. I was speaking in Florida with at a club down there, but I would say the majority of the people at this club were rock rib Republicans. Most voted for Trump. I'm talking about 80 to 90% of the group. But this was just a few weeks ago. They were so glad the Supreme Court did what there's like the George W. Bush Republicans are together with the Obamas and Clintons and all because of they never liked the tariffs. The Chamber of Commerce didn't like the tariffs. Now people aren't going to get repaid money that they were supposed to get. And the fact that the court spoke, 6-3, said we're not rubber stamping, brought a kind of a palatable relief even to a lot of Republican conservatives that said, thank goodness we're not going down this road. And it makes, I think, suddenly the Supreme Court looks more viable than it had. We waited a long year on those tariffs. And if you guys want to see some warped history, go look at the plaques Donald Trump's put up in the White House, lined up one after the other. You know, Barack Hussein Obama was, I mean, the ugliest stuff, and the Biden crime family. But I went through at the White House, and you could see them all. But the one thing that was capitalized on these plaques everywhere was tariff, capital T. You know, in this only little paragraph you get on a bronze plaque, it's like, you know, Grover Cleveland was a tariff guy like Trump. William McKinley was a tariff guy, you know, and that means a great deal to Trump. It's one consistency is his tariff belief his entire life, really, and it just got thwarted by the Supreme Court, and it was a loss for him. But now we're talking about Middle East and bombing and deflection from Epstein files, and, you know. And it seems to me that you have a president that's a bit of a wounded animal that's operating at about 36% on a good day, and it could go down. But Congress doesn't have high public opinion, and press doesn't, and there's a sense of dysfunction. The American people fed up with Washington, D.C., but Leon has pointed out, and all of us agree today, that on a state-by-state level, community by community, the vitality of America is still there, in our universities, and our research and development, and our enterprise, and in our sports, and so I feel good about the country in a lot of ways, but I feel that there's a kind of darkness falling across the land because of the Mar-a-Lago gang.
Okay, we've reached the halfway point. We've more than reached the halfway point. I'd like to take a moment to recognize our question review team, the people who are responsible for selecting the questions will be presented to our speakers. So I ask you to hold your applause while I introduce the entire group. Mike Clancy, who's with KSQD FM 90.7, David Kellogg, managing editor of the Monterey Herald, Doug McKnight, who's a reporter with KAZU Radio, and Pete Waversky, who is the managing editor of the opinion page of the San Francisco Chronicle. If you'd please give them a hand, I'd appreciate it. And Sylvia and I would, again, like to thank the Panetta Institute Board of Directors, all of our lecture series sponsors. Thank you so much for making these programs possible and allowing us to bring these important discussions to all of you. And to our audience that's watching at home, and to, obviously, the students that were part of our student program today from across Central and Northern California. If you would please give all of them a hand, I'd appreciate it as well. All right, in order to make this go as fast as we can, I'm going to direct it to different speakers here. This one is actually for Nick Kristof. You were in China covering the Tiananmen Square massacre. Based on that experience, would you say the strategy to kill Iran's leadership will empower the protesters?
We don't know, but I think that's unlikely. But let me answer in a broader way about what I took away from Tiananmen. You know, I look back at my coverage of the Tiananmen Square democracy movement with a certain amount of perhaps shame, and that's because I think often when I was writing about the democracy movement, especially by workers and peasants, that I often wrote fairly condescendingly about them and said, well, you know, they say they're for democracy, but they can't really define the kind of democracy they're for. They can't describe the guardrails or institutions that would make it work. And there was some truth to that. But that terrible night of June 3rd to 4th, 1989, when the troops rolled in toward Tiananmen Square, I saw displays of courage that I've never seen surpassed. And, you know, in particular, on the airport road, which I'm sure some of you have taken. At that point, it was just a 2-lane road. And there was a bus driver. All of Beijing had heard that troops were coming in. Everybody was alert. Everybody was trying to keep the troops away from the students to protect the students. And this bus driver, salt of the earth guy, little education, he was there with his bus. And then he saw a huge convoy of troops arriving, heading toward Tiananmen. So he quickly parked his bus across the road to block it. And he turned off the engine, had the keys at his hand, he stepped out. The convoy of troops rolled to a halt. The officer got out of the lead truck and ordered the bus driver, move the bus. And the bus driver said no. And the officer pulled out his sidearm and pointed it at the bus driver and said, move the bus. And this is the evening, night of June 3rd. It's dark. The bus driver takes the keys to the bus in his hand, and he hurls them as far as he can into the high grass by the side of the road. And I think about that guy. He might not have been able to define democracy, but he was willing to die for it. And I've come to think since then, in the last 10 years, watching democracy struggle in this country, watching our own drift toward authoritarianism. And I've come to think that actually, those guys in rural China, those workers, that maybe they had a deeper appreciation for the value of democracy and democratic institutions precisely because they had suffered so acutely from dictatorship. And that actually, maybe we in this country have a great deal to learn from the courage of those Chinese protesters then and from the Iranian protesters today about our own country.
Great. Lindsay, this was a general question about the reforms on presidential power that we might see in the next 5 to 10 years. We had Watergate and reforms occurred then. We've had reforms occur with other presidents as a result of their presidency. What do you anticipate would be the reforms with regards to the presidency in the future?
Well, first I just want to say that's an incredibly hard story to follow. Thank you for sharing that. So I think we can put the reforms into a couple of buckets. So there are things that I think we all pretty much agree on, that the pardon power is not working. And this was something that I think most people had a lot of discomfort with for a long time, and then we've seen sort of an explosion of that discomfort. Now, of course, the challenge with that is that's going to require a constitutional amendment. So there are some reforms like the pardon power that I think do require constitutional amendments, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't push for them, because amendments happen in bursts and they happen sort of unexpectedly, and we see them after moments of crisis, after the Civil War, after World War I and World War II, you tend to see this explosion. So they are possible and they should happen. There are reforms to things like corruption. I think that we should have much more stringent rules about what a president can do financially while in office, and maybe even perhaps their connections to family business. And that is not something that is just for this administration. I think there's a lot of discomfort with what can a president do to benefit, or even what can their family do to benefit. So I think the corruption piece is one that would only require legislation, so that is very, very doable. And I suspect that there will be a broad swell support for that, and hopefully a bipartisan one. Then I think there are sort of more institutional power reforms, the war powers, the ability to act in moments of emergency and crisis. And this is something that we have seen, really sort of emerged in Vietnam, where, as we have said, that there wasn't a declaration of war after World War II, and yet we have had a lot of conflict. And Congress at times has authorized force and then tried to draw it back, but clearly at this moment we do not have enough restriction on what the president can do in terms of use of force, and that needs to be mitigated. And then the last piece is what I would say is the intangible things. And so much of this goes back to George Washington, because Article 2 of the Constitution is incredibly short. And so even though we have passed bills and statutes that have tried to put into writing what we expect of a president, so much of that system is still based on norm and custom. And that was really the scaffolding of our political system. And it wasn't until we had a president who didn't care about the norms and customs that we realized that those are actually not really enforceable unless you have a sense of shame. And unless that's not supposed to be a laugh line, guys. It's not supposed to be a laugh line. And unless the American people care about enforcing the norms and customs. And so we need to find a way to enforce or to codify, to put in writing some of those norms and customs, and then to give them teeth. So, for example, the Hatch Act sets limitations about what you're supposed to do with politics and the White House, and yet it is toothless. And so it really is just an honor system. So I think there are a lot of things like that that we could put some real punch behind that would make a real difference.
Okay, thank you. Chris, this is for you. Obviously a huge decision by Trump to order the attack that we've seen, but from your past reporting, how much do you think Susie Wiles, who's the president's chief of staff, controlled the flow of information that went to the president, and what kind of advice did she provide? How would that have differed from other chiefs of staff?
Well, very hard to control the flow of information to Donald Trump. He works his phone all the time to the Tucker Carlsons and Steve Bannons of this world. And again, he's not someone who's easy to brief, as I described before. I think that the thing that fascinated me about Susie Wiles was during this 11-month process of interviewing her during Trump's first year, it was clear to me that she understood the pantheon of former White House chiefs, Leon included, that she was entering into. And she wanted me to believe, she wanted us to believe, that she was capable of telling the president hard truths. And so I got story after story about how I said, did you ever go into the president and say, wait a minute, are you sure you want to do a blanket pardon of all the January 6th insurrections? Shouldn't we look at it case by case? And she said, that's exactly the conversation I had. And she proceeded to describe how she lost that argument. Tie goes to the president. Time after time, she would try to give me examples of telling the president what he didn't want to hear, including the story about how we have a loose agreement, as she put it, that the revenge and retribution campaign will end after 90 days. 4 months later, I asked her what happened to that, and she said, "Well, it's not really a retribution tour, after all." She wanted to have it both ways, and the truth is, and I've sort of watched this evolution, was that the longer she stayed as White House chief, it seemed to me the less willing she was to pick these fights, to have these arguments. And she finally, at one point, said to me, you know, I've had other ex-White House chiefs tell me about these seminal moments when they came in and had to tell the president that something was unconstitutional. I don't have those. Well, if you don't have those with Donald Trump, of all people, you're not doing your job as White House Chief of Staff. And so that's the best answer I think I can give to that question. But when it comes to Iran, again, I'll give you one anecdote. I mean, we were talking about Venezuela and the walk up to Venezuela. I had a really spirited back and forth with her, and I said, look, they were blowing up boats and killing drug smugglers without any due process. I said, look, drug smuggling, last time I checked, was not a capital offense, even if Trump wishes it were. And she said, no, I understand that, but this is a war. And I said, a war according to whom? According to the president? I don't think he's gone to Congress about that. And she said, well, if he decides to attack land targets, then we'll need Congress. Well, we all know what happened. Maduro was grabbed without any consultation with Congress. And so I do not, although I wasn't on the inside during the walk-up to the Iran attacks, I don't think Donald Trump was hearing any hard truths that time either.
Doug, what is the history of the War Powers Act, and has any president complied with its requirements?
Well, you know, there are people that do. I mean, even pre-War Powers Act, just to not go too far back in history, because that's 1973, we're talking about. But to look at Lyndon Johnson in Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin incident, as we used to call it in grad school, in the fall of '64, Johnson was worried. Everybody said you're going to beat Barry Goldwater handily. But presidents get paranoid, and he was living because of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And the weakness of LBJ was he was seen as softer on foreign policy than Barry Goldwater, who was a hawk. It's the Cold War climate, and the Gulf of Tonkin incident is apparently we were fired. U.S. was supposed to be fired on, and Johnson immediately, no torpedo hit an American ship, but he immediately raced to Capitol Hill and got a vote with the Senate to get the war powers to go into Vietnam. Only 2 U.S. senators, Ernest Gruning of Alaska and Wayne Morris of Oregon, were the only 2 that didn't give Johnson the war powers. And so he was running in 65 LBJ, 66, 67. You're having the Monterey Pop Festival here and all this stuff, but the anti-war movement grew, but Johnson said, I got congressional approval. And then that's where Nixon gets into trouble, because he with incursion, as they used to call it, but invading of Cambodia. Because Nixon, in some ways, if you're looking at it sensibly, said the enemy, the North Vietnamese, the communists are living in Cambodia along the Mekong Delta. They're hiding there. So bottom line, he expanded the war into Cambodia. And he didn't have the right to do it. It created a hellstorm in America. Created events like the Kent State, killing. People were outraged that you didn't have a mandate. We were operating on a Vietnam mandate, not a Cambodia one. So these things happen a lot in history. I mean, this sort of abusive cycle. But I think we do need to, with America 250, to realize that our own times aren't uniquely oppressive. And just remember, like the Civil War and 650,000 dead and what we went through in our country, or we're talking about Vietnam. I mean, 58,000 dead and untold people, post-traumatic syndrome, Agent Orange, and all of that. We somehow have gotten through it. So we're going to get through what's going on right now. But we have to call abuse of power when we see it. And in my mind, President Trump's abusing power, finding loopholes in ways to do things, or just shrugging off the law that you're bigger than the law. And his hero is Al Capone. Not me saying it. He said it to the West Point class. Really, guys? When you read about Al Capone, a murderous thug, killing people, I'm an outlaw like Al Capone, It sounds quaint and funny, except he believes this sort of thing. I'm not just a president. I'm going to change the world. I mean, there's a great sickness on his naming of everything for himself. Who does such a thing? I mean, zero humility, not an ounce. And so those things are concerning. And he doesn't have a dog, and I don't see empathy.
Okay, all you dog lovers out there.
We should all chip in and buy President Trump a golden retriever.
Yes.
Nick, let me ask you this. Obviously, one of the checks, important check in our system, is the right to vote. And we've got a midterm election coming up this November that many view as perhaps a check on the administration. But there are a lot of concerns that the president might try to influence that vote or reject it in some way similar to his rejection of the 2020 election. He's talked about the federal government taking over elections. In Article 1, Section 4, it makes clear that the times, places, manner of holding elections shall be prescribed by each state. That's pretty clear. The Constitution says the states shall run elections. What is your sense about that threat becoming something that could impact on the election?
I mean, I think one of the things that a lot of people are worried about is a draft executive order that is circulating in conservative circles by people who have ties to the White House that would create an emergency on the supposed basis that China had attempted to interfere with American voting and would give the executive order, from my point of view, can't constitutionally give it, but would claim control over voting from localities for the president. And it's, this is something that was not drafted by the president, but then again, it's by people who have some record of actually getting their things adopted. So I think that is something that that everybody is very nervous about. What happens if he tries to institute that? And more broadly, I mean, I think people worry about the use of federal agents in areas to suppress voting. If there are some areas where there's a Latino presence, then if suddenly you get a bunch of ICE people around the ballot boxes that day, that is going to suppress voting. And it won't suppress it 100%. It may not suppress it 10%. Could it suppress it 5%? Absolutely, in ways that would affect the outcome. But I would also just make the point that while we have to stand up toward efforts by the president to manipulate votes, I think it's also incumbent on us to do the best we can for our part to try to, to me, this year's Senate elections in particular seem absolutely crucial for where this country is going to go for the next few years. Absolutely pivotal. Nothing more urgent than getting people like Sherrod Brown elected in Ohio. And I don't think that has sunk in to either Democrats or Republicans. And tomorrow, as you know, there's the Texas Senate primary, and incredibly, Republicans may shoot themselves in the foot by choosing their worst candidate, Ken Paxton, and Democrats may shoot themselves in the foot by choosing somebody who is not their best candidate. And this so much is at stake in this election. And likewise, I do it, look, as one West Coaster to another West Coaster, I think we have to face the reality that one reason Sherrod Brown lost in Ohio and that we lost the Senate was that we on the West Coast, we screwed up our own governance. And for centrist voters in places like Ohio, they looked at Portland and they looked at San Francisco and they said, Democrats can't govern. And we have to do a better job governing our blue places, not just because it's the right thing to do at home, but because of the message it sends around the country about the importance of governance, about the ability of Democrats to actually govern their own spaces effectively. So I hope that we will take that to heart and do a better job at our own blue parts of the country.
Lindsay, on immigration, America has a history of immigration going back to our founding. And we've had waves of immigration that have come from Europe, from Asia, from Latin America. And I think we truly are a land of immigrants. I'm the son of immigrants. There's growing concern, obviously, about immigration, that the system is broken. But rather than focusing on comprehensive immigration reform, which is something I was a part of, when I was in Congress, we did comprehensive immigration reform on a bipartisan basis, and Ronald Reagan signed the bill. Right now, there's no effort at really trying to pass. I mean, frankly, the president could take a great step by recommending comprehensive immigration reform to deal with every aspect on immigration. But instead, there's obviously a focus on deportation and the problems that we saw in Minneapolis. Is what's happening with immigration part of a long history of conflict, or is this something different?
It's absolutely just the latest chapter in a very long history. And this goes all the way back to the 1790s when, you know, the Alien and Sedition Acts have been in the news. But the Alien and Sedition Acts were actually 4 bills. And the first of the bills was a Naturalization Act that made it harder to become a citizen. It increased the number of years from 7 to 14. And it implemented a number of very onerous reporting requirements along the way because immigrants tended to vote for the Democratic Republicans. And so the Federalist Congress wanted to prevent that new voter base from coming in. Just a couple of years earlier, in 1793, when there was a yellow fever epidemic, there was a raging battle over what was the cause of this pandemic. And the Federalists believed that it was immigrants coming from the Caribbean that were bringing it with them. And the Democratic Republicans believed it was the cities being places of pestilence and sin, because cities were largely controlled by the Federalists. And so there was a conflation over debates over pandemics and immigrants. And that's just one example in the 1790s. Spoiler alert, they were both right. The mosquitoes were coming from the Caribbean, but then were thriving in the disgusting ports in the cities because there was no sewage. And we've seen this over and over and over again, where I think we see change over time is who counts as an immigrant, who counts as the right type of immigrant, who counts as a citizen. So I'm sure you've all seen those pictures of the Irish need not apply. Irish used to be considered not white. Same for Italians. Of course, there were good Asians and bad Asians. So there was a gentleman's agreement that Theodore Roosevelt made with the Japanese, who were considered the more civilized of the Asian nations, to try and keep some Japanese out, whereas the Chinese were seen as the lesser than. So really, I think the story of U.S. immigration is there have been moments where we have been principled in wanting to welcome in people to the United States, but those tend to be few and far between. And we welcome in people because we recognize that we need labor, and we recognize that we are often getting the best of a place who's coming here to make a better life. And that sort of brain drain from other nations into the United States has made us a stronger nation. But the current fights over it are only the latest chapter. And I agree with you. I mean, the goal, obviously, everyone wants, I think, a safe nation. Everyone wants a safe border. But as someone who was born and raised in California, I understand that we also need people coming into the nation in order to work here. And how lucky are we that people want to come to this place and make a life here and be proud of this nation. And that is an extraordinary privilege that I think we've forgotten.
Great, thank you. Chris, I want to ask you, I've got a card here that talks about misinformation online and should it be regulated, but let me ask you, the impact of social media is immense right now. And we did a poll for students as to where they get their information. They don't get it from television. They don't get it from the newspapers. They get it from social media. Yeah. So social media has a tremendous impact, and there's a lot of misinformation on social media. Yeah. How do you deal with that? How does the president deal with that?
Yeah. Well, I think, alas, the president simply contributes to the polarization. The Truth Social, I mean, we all saw how he portrayed the Obamas on Truth Social, and it's pretty ugly out there, but not much uglier than that. So I don't think there's any question about where the president stands when it comes to social media. Boy, that's a question way above my pay grade as to how we solve it. I had an experience speaking to a class of high school seniors recently in Greenwich, Connecticut, Greenwich Country Day School, really affluent bunch of kids, smart kids. And it turns out they all get their information from two sources. Around the dinner table with their parents. These are kids who have dinner with their parents. And TikTok. That was the answer, by and large. So it's a discouraging state of affairs, and you know, I'm an old media guy. I still go to sources that I trust that have been around for a while, so-called legacy media like the Times and the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. Nick occasionally suffers through the Wall Street Journal every morning.
Nice character.
But, you know, there's still plenty of great journalism out there and trusted sources. How we steer the younger generation to those trusted sources is a tough one.
Can I say something?
Sure.
I did a book called Cronkite, Walter Cronkite, and it was last year's. Got to ask Cronkite what he's most worried about. Somebody who's followed everything from, you know, he was in World War II, and through space and Vietnam and everything. He was most worried about what you're saying with young people in particular, not giving access to the wild west of the internet, with the iPhone, with go at it, kid, you're 12 years old, with nobody telling them what's fact, what's not fact, what's a hate site, what's a misogynistic site. And it's no guide manual. And so we probably have to get back to schools, not just civics, not just teaching geography, but teaching a course at a young age. First off, a lot of schools are saying no iPhone in school, period. And number two, learning how to at least be able to identify information from conspiracy to misinformation in some realm. That would be a big leap forward if we could start doing that, I think, in our schools.
Let me ask, you know, with Jesse Jackson's death recently, and the long struggle for equality to try to achieve the goal that we are all created equal. We've been through Civil War, Jim Crow, Civil Rights Movement, Brown versus the Board of Education, Civil Rights Acts, Voting Rights Acts. But today, there seems to be, in the Supreme Court and the administration, has taken on diversity and affirmative action and possibly voting rights. The court has a decision to make on that. I guess the question is, have we become, and I think this is the argument the court uses, have we become a colorblind society, or are we still fighting the battle for equality? Nick?
I mean, there's overwhelming evidence that we are not colorblind, and I mean, the classic studies on this are you call up a realtor and you ask about rentals, and if you have a name that sounds more African American, then you're going to be shown a lot fewer properties than if you have a name that sounds quote unquote white. And same about applying for jobs. And I mean, across the gamut, every way you can tell, there is still a considerable cost to being African American, still continuing significant discrimination. And you know, there was a fascinating study in the NBA of NBA refs, and it found that NBA refs were more likely to call a foul on a player of a different race than themselves. This was true of white refs and black refs. And this caused a huge stir. The study got a lot of attention. The NBA was outraged. They said this was absolute nonsense, but it caused a lot of attention. And then maybe 6-7 years later, there was a follow-up study by the same social scientists, two economists who'd done the first study. And they found that actually by the second study, this bias had gone away. And to me, the lesson was that if you actually confront these kinds of unconscious biases, if you talk about them, if you understand the human propensity for discrimination, for bias, then you can begin to overcome it. But you have to be willing to have these difficult, sometimes painful conversations about our own very human propensities to discriminate against people around us.
Okay, we're in our concluding moments here, but I've asked this question to other panels, and I want to ask you, please give me as brief an answer as you can. But looking at our history and looking at what's going on today, are you feeling optimistic or pessimistic about the future of our country in the 21st century? Let's start with you, Chris.
You know, my wife calls me the glass half full guy, so I tend to be an optimist about this stuff. I was there's a quote from Churchill, and Lindsay started this quoting Churchill, so I think I'm allowed to do it. And he said that, you know, you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they've exhausted every other possibility. And that's sort of the way I feel about the upcoming midterms.
Okay. Nick?
We've tried it, and it's time.
Go ahead.
You know, we've come through such enormous trial. Look, the challenges today are absolutely enormous. Their risks are great. But think about what we've come through, you know, from the Vietnam War, Watergate, I was born, actually, when I was born in 1959, I was born in a hospital that discriminated, that had separate, black babies were born on one floor in maternity ward, a separate maternity ward for white kids. And I was concerned about this as a fetus, and so I arrived prematurely because the ward for preemies.
We've got 1 minute. So.
The ward for preemies was integrated, and so considering that.
Optimistic. Lindsay?
So he took Churchill, I'll take Lincoln. Lincoln said, I'm an optimist because I don't see the point in being anything else. I'm just not willing to give up on the country, and so optimism is the only option.
Doug?
Completely agree. I'm optimistic. It has to be. There's no other choice. You know, Theodore Roosevelt, FDR, Ronald Reagan used to say essentially that optimism is the oxygen of our country, that we've got to go forward and believe. And you can't be a teacher. I've been being a professor for a long time with a dour message because they're 18, 19, 20. Their whole lives are in front of them like a thundercloud. Okay. So you do hope. Hope.
Thank you. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our program. And I obviously want to thank the speakers who've been great. This is an important discussion that we've had tonight. And we've touched a lot of topics, and there are others that we didn't get to. But I think the bottom line is that we do have to remember that this is the greatest country on the face of the earth, that Americans believe in our values and our Constitution, and that ultimately is what will always protect our democracy in the future. Thank you for being here, and good night.